At that time, the Roman Emperor Augustus decreed that a census should be taken throughout the Roman Empire. This was the first census taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. All returned to their own ancestral towns to register for this census, and because Joseph was a descendant of King David, he had to go to Bethlehem in Judea, David's ancient home. He traveled there from the village of Nazareth in Galilee. He took with him Mary, his fiancée, who was now obviously pregnant. And while they were there, the time came for her baby to be born. She gave birth to her first child, a son. She wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger, because there was no lodging available for them.
Well, it was March of 1863 when Charles Longfellow walked out of his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, unbeknownst to his family, jumped on a train that would travel 400 miles along the eastern seaboard to join Lincoln's Union Army in the Civil War. It was the latest in a series of rough events for his father, the famous poet and literary critic Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who'd been going through a lot in that season of his life. Less than 2 years earlier, Henry's wife had passed away. Pretty tragically. Her dress had actually caught on fire. He woke up to her screams in the middle of a nap, tried everything he could to put that fire out, first with a rug and then with his own body, but he wouldn't be able to save her from the severe burns that she had suffered. And in fact, he himself suffered such bad burns that he was unable to go to her funeral as he was in recovery. In fact, the history books tell us that he was in such deep grief that many of his family members wondered if he was going to get sent to an asylum because of the state of his life and his emotions. Now, this widowed father of 6 would lose his oldest to a war that his country was fighting with itself, wondering what the future would hold for him. And if all that wasn't bad enough, of December of that same year in 1863, he would get a telegraph that days earlier his son Charles had been severely injured in that war he had left the family to go and fight in a skirmish in the Battle of the Mine Run campaign, had been shot through the left shoulder. That bullet had grazed his spine before exiting in his right shoulder, leaving him almost paralyzed, and a recovery that was going to take all kinds of months, and not really knowing if he would ever make a full recovery. So as you can imagine, when Christmas came that year, December 25th, 1863, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wasn't exactly in the best of spirits. As he heard outside his home these bells ringing from carolers as they sang from Luke chapter 2, peace on earth, goodwill to men, he couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the dissidence and what he felt in his own heart and what his country was going through, and the hopefulness of the gospel message that these carolers were singing about. He felt something much different than what they were singing, and it brought him to write one of the most famous poems of all time that day, on Christmas Day, called Christmas Day, that's been turned into a song, writing and talking about what he was feeling in terms of his own heart and comparison to the gospel. He says this: I heard the bells on Christmas Day their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And thought how, as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along the unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Till ringing, singing on its way, the world revolved from night to day, a voice, a chime, a chant sublime of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then from each black accursed mouth the cannon thundered in the south, and with the sound the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And it was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent and made forlorn the households born of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. But then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. Love that poem, and the imagery is so powerful with this striking theme of peace, of hope. He had observed this world of injustice and violence around him and experienced some of it himself. It seemed to mock the truthfulness of this optimistic outlook in the Gospels of Scripture, but eventually was led, as the poem goes on, to this settledness of a confident hope, despite the despair that he was feeling in his own life. In a way, this is what happens when we celebrate Advent. When we come to this season, we look at the problems and the sin and the issues of the world, and then Advent kind of comes rushing into our lives, beckoning us, pushing us to go to Jesus' birth, to his arrival, to his eventual death, his resurrection, and the promise that he will be coming again. It's this time when we celebrate and anticipate with hopefulness what God has done and in doing in the midst of our despair. We realize that he has and will triumph over all. In fact, that's what we're trying to do as a church. If you've not been around over the last few weeks, we've been in a series this December called Adventually, this play on words as we celebrate Advent for the first time around here. And as we explained in week 1, Advent is simply a Latin word meaning arrival or coming, describing Jesus' first and second coming. It doesn't actually appear in Scripture, but instead it was a holiday, a season that early Christians in the centuries that followed what we read about in Scripture put on the calendar after what they had seen, what they were reading from Scripture, and something that they would put and include every single year. And in doing so, together they looked at the worst in the world, reminded themselves of the redemption that we all need, and then saturated themselves in the worship of these two arrivals of Jesus as an answer to it. They would read and celebrate the Christmas story that we all know and love, and would see God's work in the past of bringing Jesus in his first coming, and then they would read and anticipate God's promise of a second coming when he would come again and make all things right. In other words, Advent kind of had a double meaning. We said in week 1, it's bifocal worship. When we come to this time of year, we're not just reading the Christmas story and celebrating Jesus the baby, we're also celebrating the coming King. We don't just come and kneel before a manger, we also kneel before a throne. And that's what we're trying to do as a church this season. Remind yourself of what Jesus has done and what he's doing and what we look like in between. Now, as we explained, when we really truly get Advent, Advent's not really a passive season. It's more than us just singing some songs or reading a reading plan. Those things are good. Advent really should spill over to the rest of our lives. And Daryl talked a little bit about this, that we don't just last week wait and watch the sky waiting for Jesus' arrival. No, Advent begins to seep into all that we are and impact the way that we live in the midst of this dark world. So last week, Daryl kind of broke down this imagery of us standing between earth and heaven, kind of this imagery of us standing between the two Advents. And I want to pick up on that very same theme, this idea, just with some different imagery, as we talk about living between the darkness and the light. And to do so, there's no better place for us to do that than in John chapter 1. So if you've got a Bible or an electronic device, open up there with me. We're going to read a lot of Scripture this morning, but that's a great starting place for us. And I got to tell you, the goal of this morning is very simple. I want to help you understand the imagery of darkness and light as it appears throughout Scripture, how it connects to Advent in your own life, and then I want to leave you with some reflection questions at the very end. Look there with me. John chapter 1, starting in verse 1. It says this. In the beginning, the Word being the Greek word logos, meaning Jesus, already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He existed in the beginning with God. God created everything through him, and nothing was created except through him. The Word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. God sent a man, John the Baptist, to tell about the light so that everyone might believe because of his testimony. John himself was not the light. He was simply a witness to tell about this coming light. The one who was the true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. Flip down to verse 14. So the Word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. Stop there. Now, this is not the Christmas story as we know and love it in all the details, but John instead starts his gospel by introducing Jesus' arrival with some imagery we might be able to understand through this concept of darkness and light. Now, there's a lot going on in this text, and I can't unpack all the incredible depth that is here, but I definitely want to hone in on that one idea of darkness and light that John keeps getting at, because it's very clear what he's trying to do. He's wanting to get his audience, and ultimately us, to think back to a very important prophecy from the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 9. We've read that several times already in this series, mostly in verses 6 and 7 that reference that a child will be born, that he's going to be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. We know that one very well. But earlier in that chapter, the prophecy actually gets going in verse 2 when Isaiah says this: "The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. For those who live in a land of deep darkness, a light will shine." Scholars will actually point out that in the original Hebrew this was written in, that phrase, walk in darkness, is actually a created compound word from the prophet Isaiah that literally translates to death shadow. Death shadow. Isaiah is connecting and is linking darkness with death and light with life. Scripture's done this before. In fact, we know in Genesis chapter 1, God begins his work of creation, of creating life, by saying, "Let there be light." And we know from just a purely scientific level, this is kind of true. Light and life are linked. A few years ago, Popular Science produced an article talking about what would happen if the sun burned out, which I think is a very awful thing to sit around and write about. I don't know who's reading this, except for preachers who want illustrations, but that someone is. And they determined, theorized, that if the sun were to burn out, it would be 0 degrees by the end of the day. It would be negative 100 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the week, and that the temperature would kind of settle in at negative 400 degrees Fahrenheit in the world. Not very sustainable for life. As you can imagine, photosynthesis would basically cease to exist. All that oxygen we're getting because of that process would not be there. We would suffocate. Vitamin A and D that we get from the sun that helps make our bones strong, that would no longer be there unless we were able to stockpile for years and years and years to anticipate it, so our bones would crumble. Life would basically cease to exist. And in the same way, Isaiah is trying to get us to think through, because of sin, we were cut off to this relationship. We were cut off from our life source, the light, so to speak, this intimacy, this future with our God. And so because of that, our bodies not only are crumbling, but so are our souls. And the effects of this darkness are all around us. Death, decay, evil, despair. But in the midst of this, Isaiah tries to tell us, hey, there is a light coming. Don't worry. Life is going to be possible once again. God is up to something, and that's what John is picking up on. In fact, he wants his audience, and he ultimately wants us to get this message, and it's the very first point I want you to get this morning, that Jesus is the true light. That's what he's trying to connect to what Isaiah said. John's picking up on it from the onset of his gospel, that this life-giving light that Isaiah predicted, hey, guess what? That is Jesus. This imagery actually gets picked up on throughout John's writing. In fact, in the words of Jesus himself, in John 8:12, Jesus would famously say, "I am the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness, because you will have the light that leads to life." You see, Jesus came to earth, as John tells us, and life became a reality once more. Jesus' arrival announced God's work, his plan to restore our dark and lifeless reality. His death would serve as a penalty for our sin, and his resurrection would put death in the grave. The first advent, in other words, is literally God telling us that he's illuminated our empty, hopeless, darkened lives, that there is hope beyond the darkness that we see all around us in the here and now. In fact, as verse 14 showed earlier that we read in chapter 1, God's glory was revealed. He came and he gave us a flicker of light into the darkness. In Christ, the ideal became real. Our dreams, our cries, our hopes became realized. God broke through this veil of this death shadow, and he illuminated our lives through Christ. But John's writing doesn't end on this subject right here. In fact, we know this flicker of light is only the first advent. John's eventually going to write about the second one. In fact, he would go on to pen the very last book in the Bible we call Revelation. It was a chance for him to get this glimpse of heaven and write to us to anticipate what was going to be coming for us. And in that, he begins to tell us that there's not just going to be a day where there's a light in the darkness, there's a day coming where the darkness will not exist at all. A day not only where Jesus is going to end injustice and end our sin, there's a day where those things are no longer a reality. Revelation chapter 21, verse 23, he says this, "And the city has no need for a sun or a moon, for the glory of God illuminates the city, and the Lamb is the light," that Lamb being Jesus. Chapter 22, verse 5, a chapter later, he reiterates, "And there will be no night there. There is no need for lamps or sun, for the Lord God will shine on them, and they will reign forever and ever." You see, what John is trying to put in human words for us is what Isaiah described all the way back in his prophecy. That at this second coming, when Jesus comes again, the darkness will cease to exist. When Jesus returns, justice will reign for all of those who have been in him. They will experience the reality that God intended from the very beginning, one where there is no death shadow looming over us. Now, when we get this, Jesus being the light in the first advent and Jesus being in the light in the second advent, we again, some of you already ahead of me, connect the dots of us standing in the in-between. Well, that's great, the first one, that's great on the second one, but what about us now? We're standing between this glimmer of light 2,000 years ago and this saturation of light that is to come when Jesus comes again. But what are we supposed to do standing between those two advents? What are we supposed to do in the here and now as the darkness seems to be all around us? Well, Jesus tells us in John 12, 35 and 36. Walk in darkness, Jesus says, while you can, so the darkness will not overtake you. Those who walk in the darkness cannot see where they are going. Put your trust in the light while there is still time. Then you will become children of light. He says, walk in the light while you can. Don't continue living in darkness. And once you get to that light, you're going to become a bearer of it. He actually says it more overtly in the famous Matthew chapter 5, where he says, starting in verse 14, "You are the light of the world. Like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and then places it underneath a basket. Instead, the lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light for everyone in the house." You see what he's saying? He's saying in the in-between, we have a role. This is the second thing I want you to get. That the church is the beacon of the light, of that light being Jesus. You see, 2 Peter 3:9 tells us that God is not slow playing us. He's not just waiting around bored thinking, oh, I'm going to let them suffer a little bit longer. No, instead, he's incorporated us in his mission to bring light to the darkness. He's incorporated us into that plan. He wants us to shine his message to the dark world so that every single person can have a chance to walk in the light and no longer walk in the darkness. There's a day coming when he returns where the darkness is going to cease to exist and all those who walk in it. And so he wants everyone to have a chance to walk in the light. That's where we come in. And so I want you to imagine us as like a group of solar panel lights who are soaking up our light source to energize our batteries so that when the darkness comes, we can shine our light collectively to show truth, to show reality, to show life in the darkness. That's our role in God's kingdom. In fact, the New Testament authors understood this all the way through. Ephesians 5:8 says, "For once you were full of darkness, but now you have the light from the Lord. So live as people in the light." 1 Peter 2:9 says, "But you are not like that, for you are a chosen people, your royal priest, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for you were called out of darkness and into his wonderful light." 2 Corinthians 4:5-6. You see, we don't go around preaching about ourselves. We preach that Jesus Christ is Lord, and we ourselves are servants for Jesus' sake. For God, it was God who said, "Let there be light in the darkness," has made this light shine in our hearts so that we can know the glory of God that is seen in the face of Jesus Christ. You hear what these authors are over and over saying again, the same thing. We're the beacon of that light. So Advent, in other words, is not just a reminder to us of God's work in either season, each Advent, each arrival. It's also a reminder to us that God has incorporated us in that plan. That we're part of this plan of bringing light to the darkness, and our sole responsibility in the in-between of these two Advents is to be a bearer, to be a beacon of the light to our dark world. We broadcast and we say that this darkness, this depravity, this death that is all around us, the wars, the racism, the sexism, the crime, the hatred, the vile nature of our culture, it is a fleeting and passing thing. There is life to be found even in the midst of this darkness, and we broadcast that light to this our dark world around us. And so when we understand this, it's a very easy concept that's just getting pounded at us over and over again in Scripture. When we get this, it really leaves us with one question, which I want to ask you and unpack with you in our remaining time together. Are you shining the light of Christ in our dark world? Scripture tells us Jesus is the light. It tells us we're supposed to be agents and beacons of that light. Are you shining it? Are you shining it into the dark world? You see, Advent reminds us that being Christian is more than just simply, do you believe in Jesus? Advent is a reminder that it's more than, hey, do you love Jesus? I hope you do. But it's more than that. It's more than just some philanthropic good around the holidays too. It's a lifestyle. The New Testament tells us that if we are no longer living underneath the death shadow and we are walking in the light, then we need to be broadcasting that light to the world. That's our sole responsibility. 1 John 1, 5-6 says this, "This is a message we heard from Jesus, and now we declare to you, God is light, and there is no darkness in him at all. So if we are lying, John says. We are lying if we say we have fellowship with God, but go on living in spiritual darkness. We are not practicing the truth," he says. We have to walk in the light if we say we know Jesus. That's what he says. We got to broadcast it. Eugene Peterson puts it this way, that the church is a colony of heaven in a country of death. We stand apart. We look different than the world around us. Are you shining that light of Jesus in your life? If we send some investigators in, would they say you're shining that light when they look at your life, your marriage, your household, your workplace, your school, your hobbies, your friends, your neighbors? Would they look and say, yeah, they're shining the light of Jesus? Not sure? Well, let me help you with that. In fact, very quickly, let me give you three things that I think you need to reflect on and maybe have some introspection this Advent season and ask yourself if you're truly living in the light. 3 ways that I think we compromise being light bearers of the hopefulness and the hope in not just in the here and now, but what is to come. I think they're the error of hedonism, the error of hopelessness, and the error of humanism. I want you to reflect on each of these 3 because they might help you answer that question. Are you really shining the light of Christ in our dark world? Let me unpack them. The first one, the error of hedonism. When we think of that word hedonistic, most of us think of something probably pretty extreme. Most of us wouldn't describe ourselves as being hedonists. We think of somebody who's engaged in wild living or has sexual promiscuity or is crazily addicted to a substance, whatever it is. But it's really much more simplistic than that. Being a hedonist is just basically this theory that pleasure and the fulfillment of our own desires is the chief aim, the proper aim of our human existence. For being honest, most of us are there. It's all around us all the time, isn't it? We hear these slogans and these phrases thrown out in our culture at us of YOLO, carpe diem, seize the day. So because of that, there's all these thoughts that permeate our thinking all the time of, hey, if it feels good, do it. If it makes you happy, that's the thing you need to follow. And so that kind of becomes kind of the mantra of our lives. That becomes the aim of what we do. Just make myself happy, make myself fulfilled. And please hear me, God's not wanting you to be miserable on earth. He wants you to enjoy his creation. But when we become synonymous with all of our lives, become connected to the here and now and not of the hope of someday, we can't be the light. We can't be. It's for that very reason that we talk so much around here about the big T3, time, talent, treasure. Because we see ourselves as almost being advisors to where your investment is going on this earth. And if at the end of the year, especially at a time like now, when you evaluate and look back over your last 12 months, it's a great time for you to look and say, where am I investing all of my resources? When I look at my time, when I look at my talent, when I look at my money, where am I investing just in the here and now or what's to come? Because honestly, if we're looking back, most of us, when we look at our house buying, our car shopping, our clothes purchases, our career ambitions, our family schedule, our time allotment, our relationships, our marriages, our parenting, you name it, all of it shows that our investments are completely locked in a world that the Bible tells us is one that is passing away and is fleeting. And as long as all of our investments are locked in that, there is no way that we can be light in the dark world and say that our hope is in something much greater than the here and now. Makes me think back to a few years ago when two couples that I love, both in their 60s, went totally different ways. One built their dream house, a $750,000 home in their 60s, and the other one said, we no longer have any kids, we don't need to keep living in a mansion, and so they downsized their house so that they could spend the remaining days on earth investing, being freed up to invest in God's kingdom as best they could. They're both people I love. But one of them was clearly investing all of their resources in the here and now, even though they didn't even have that much here and now left. And there was another who was saying, you know what, I know I've got a hope in something much greater. That's just financial, but there's all kinds of implications. When you look, are you being hedonistic? I would say a lot of us are. Our whole lives are about our own pleasure, our own joy. And so I want to ask you, how in the world, if that's you, how in the world can you broadcast this life-giving light if you're completely invested in a world of decay and death? The second one is the error of hopelessness. This actually plays out very similarly to the first one. It just, it really comes from the same root thing. It just gets manifested in a slightly different way. You see, people who are hopeless are just as invested in the here and now. They're just as invested in this world that is in the death shadow. They just have seen some of those investments go awry. They've dealt with hardship, they've dealt with pain, maybe things haven't worked out economically as much as they would like them to, and so because of it, hopelessness ensues. There's all kinds of classic philosophers and poets throughout the years who have lived there. We read their literature, we're required to in English class. Many of us feel the same way. And out of that hopelessness, with this, we kind of almost act as if there's no assurance of future. And so we end up kind of getting drowned in isolation or introversion. Maybe we become cynical of the world around us in general. We become hate-filled, angry, depressed. Maybe even worse, we end up getting addicted to some form of substance that helps us feel like we have this out-of-body experience from the here and now. We become hopeless. And I want to be honest with you, there is no way for us to be the light to the world if we're living around being hopeless. If we're acting like everything's ruined, if we're cynics, if no one enjoys being around us, or we're removing ourselves from other people because we've given up hope. We've shown that all of our hope is placed in the death shadow and not in the light that has given us life. And if I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this is a much greater battle that we're fighting in our neck of the woods. I was just reading an article this last week about how rural America is facing hopelessness in a way that is unprecedented, and because of it, there is drug and addictions that are just basically moving forward at an unprecedented rate. In fact, I don't know if you know this, I just saw IU announce that they're spending tens of millions of dollars to deal with the opioid crisis that's dealing with our state, because since 1999, we're one of 4 states in the country where overdose rates have quadrupled. There's a lot of people that are living hopeless, and there's no way I can imagine that there's not some people walking in our doors who feel that way. And I want to challenge you, man, find some people around you who can get you help, who want to love on you and can breathe that life-giving light into you, because there is no way we can have all of our hope in the here and now, be brought down by the world's problems and our own hopelessness, and shine the light of Jesus into the dark world. There's a third error, that of humanism. Humanism is kind of a broad topic. It's probably worthy of its own sermon, but it's basically just this idea that we are devoted to totally to human welfare. This idea broke out in medieval Europe, where we kind of downplayed God's involvement and we overplayed our own involvement of trying to make sure human advancement and flourishing happening. And it dominates our westernized thinking. Our entire country was founded on it. Our country was founded by deists who thought God was this far-off, distant deity, that he didn't involve himself in the affairs of man, and that it was all up to us to advance and to flourish. And so you see it everywhere. It's the reason why a couple of 100 years into this experiment called America, we are increasingly becoming secularized. Because all of our hope is in things like science and education and politics. That last one, something that a lot of us, even in the church, has penetrated us in our hearts. I tick people off a lot when I kind of stop and pause on this issue because everybody loves to talk about politics, especially in the here and now. But I want to remind you that Advent is a great chance for us to remember that if politics were what were going to save us, Jesus would have come as a king, or he would have come as a president, or he would have become in the midst of a political system. He didn't. He became as a poor servant, and he laid down his life, and he began to usher in a kingdom unlike anything that our world has seen. In fact, it threatens every leader, just as it did Herod at its very inception. And some of us have gotten way too caught up with whether or not we're known as a Republican or a Democrat or a progressive or a conservative than we have whether or not we've been a Christian. And we debate about it, and we argue, and we put all of our hope in it, and because of it, we can't be light. I was reminded of this last week when I was reading Russell Moore, who wrote this in the midst of an article. He says, "We are bored by what the Bible reveals as mysterious and glorious, and we are red in the face about what hardly matters in the broad sweep of eternity." Too many of us have become known more by political systems and human advancement by worldly means than we have about the light that came and is coming again. We've got to put our chips on one of those two. It can't be both. The Christian story is that we put all of our faith, not in the here and now, but the age that is passing away. We place it in Jesus Christ. Makes me think of an incredible book I love called Resident Aliens, where an illustration, a story in it from Stanley Hauerwas, who's a Duke professor of divinity and law, tells a story of a former president who had bombed Libya. Because there was some unrest there. And so as he was walking across campus, there was a bunch of law students that were debating the morality of such an act. So he stood there and he watched some of it go on. And so finally one of them spotted him, knowing his being an icon on the campus, and pulled him into the debate. And they said, "Hey, preacher man, what do you think about this?" And he sat and thought about it for a minute. And he said, "Well, as a Christian, there's just no way I can support a bombing, especially if innocent lives were taken as they were." And one of his adversaries chimed in and said, "Well, isn't that just like you Christians? You always want to be on the higher moral ground. You cry foul when a terrorist kills a little kid, and then when the president does something about it, you're mad about that too." He kind of chuckled to himself, thinking, you know what, this person only thinks that there's two options, to be a progressive or be a conservative, support the government or support the UN. He said, "We have an alternative." And so he spoke up and he said, "Yeah, you're right." He goes, "What would a Christian response to this whole thing be?" He said, "Off the top of my head, that one of our mainline denominations would announce tomorrow that they're going to send 1,000 missionaries to Libya, that they've seen that it is a right place for the gospel to be proclaimed, and that they're going to dedicate all their resources." And the adversary chimed in again, "Well, you can't do that. President of the government won't let you do that. You can't get a visa to go into that country." And he interrupted him. He said, "No, we can't do that. Not because the president or the government won't let us, but because we don't have people that bold anymore, but we once did." His point is valid. As long as we continue to buy into some of this darkness and some of these things in the here and now, we lose our ability to live boldly in the light and proclaim it to our dark world. There's too many of us that have been there. And so I want to ask you on that one, how in the world can we broadcast this life-giving light if we're continually pursuing advancement by worldly methods and schemes? See, the Gospels tell us that Jesus is the light. He's the one true light. It's where all of our hope is. And that we are agents, we are beacons of that light. And so it really leaves us with one question all the time. Are we shining that light in the dark world? If you've settled for any of those other ones, you're missing the boat. You're missing the boat. You're missing what God wants you to be living in so that you can proclaim, just as Henry Wadsworth Longfellow did so long ago, God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail. Peace on earth, goodwill to men. Let's pray. God, we thank you so much, God, that you have given us life when we were in the midst of the death shadow, when we were walking in darkness. You proclaimed and you broadcasted to us where life and hope could be found. God, I pray that we would live as that beacon of that light if you've called us to as your church, that we would not settle for any other means in the here and now, God, that all of our investments, all of our hope, all of our dreams would not be tied with what we can just see now. But instead we would totally hinge our entire existence on what you've promised us in the age to come. We pray all this in your name. Amen.